This was once the center of the imperial capital of the Mughals at their height. Built by Shah Jahan, it was one of the grandest capitals of its time. Today, part of a sprawling city edging in, it is hard to find the old glory within the maze it has become. Old shops, jostling crowds, and still thriving commerce remind us of how life has been busy here for hundreds of years. But go deeper in and you will find hints of the grandeur, the layers and layers of history. Author, historian, and the convener of INTAC in Delhi, Swapna Liddle, has worked and researched on 19th century Delhi and has been fascinated by Shahjahanabad, a city that has seen so much, survived, and thrived. She takes us on a journey through the once grand capital.
It's a city of immense history. I mean, Delhi is a city of immense history. And the last at the heyday of the Mughal Empire, or at least from Shah Jahan onwards, it was Shahjahanabad which was it. When you go there today and then you look at sources, you're looking at texts and old travelers' descriptions from the 17th century and the 18th century, and they're talking about those lovely coffee shops, and you're looking at the grand sarai which Jahanara built for travelers who came from Iran and from Uzbekistan, and you're looking at the hammam where these people used to go for what we would call spa treatments today. It's very hard to imagine that all that existed where we go now, which is completely transformed in some ways. Many of those structures themselves have disappeared, or where the structures exist, they have fallen into to ruin in most cases. But romance is still there, because you see it and you say, wow, this is where Nadir Shah sat and overlooked the massacre of Delhi citizens that he had ordered. This was in 1739. Now, it moves you in some ways to see that these are places where historic things have happened. When Shahjahanabad was founded in the middle of the 17th century by Shah Jahan, he was building on a place that was not a complete wasteland. There was already some construction, some population living in this area. And we must remember that this also was traversed by what we today call the Grand Trunk Road. And this was a major trade artery. As far as Delhi is concerned, it's coming from the north and it's going south towards Mathura. And what part of it we call Mathura Road today. And this was coming through here, and therefore when Shah Jahan built Shahjahanabad, a part of that Grand Trunk Road was also taken into within the walls of this new city. That's the road which we call Sitaram Bazaar and Lal Kuan. And along that you'll see some of the oldest structures of Shahjahanabad, which predate Shahjahanabad. So you have Razia Sultan's tomb. She died in 1240, and the reason she was buried here was because there was a Sufi saint of the Sohrawardi order. Shamsul Arifin was his name, and he is known popularly as Shah Turkuman Biyabani, and he had died a few months ago, again in 1240. And in 1240 this was a jungle, it was a wasteland. So Biyabani literally refers to that, because Biyaban is wilderness. So this was a saint who had come and started living in the wilderness, and that is where Razia was when she died. She had been, of course, a ruler, but by the time she died, a rival had taken, one of her brothers had taken over, rival factions of the nobility had taken over, and she died in not in complete ignominy but quite close. Shah Turkman Biyabani was buried here in 1240. It's interesting because, as I said, Razia was buried next to him. She was actually buried not right next to him, but a little bit at a distance and up a hill. So you have to climb up a little bit. It's slightly raised ground that you go up, and there is where her grave lies, and that's where she is. But Shah Turkman's Dargah has seen a very interesting development since then, because many people wanted to be buried very close to the saint. So there have been generations and centuries of burial from the mid 13th century, and all continuously there have been burials, and therefore the level of the ground has been rising, and the level of the ground has risen to such an extent that now the original grave of Shah Turkman is actually at a much lower level. So you have had subsequent gateways built which are at a higher level, subsequent burials which are at a higher level. So it's a very interesting, the archaeology of the area would be very interesting. And moreover, not only that, but what was a large burial ground, much of it has actually been built upon in the form of houses now. So it's become a mohalla, it's called the mohalla Kabristan. So therefore the name also is important, because it evokes an earlier era when this was literally just a burial ground surrounding the saint. But things started changing quite fast, because by the time you came to the 14th century, in the mid 14th century, Firoz Shah Tughlaq was on the throne, and in the second half of the 14th century, in 1387 in fact, his prime minister Khane-Jahan Junan Shah, he built a few large mosques. He had built a few large mosques around Delhi, and one of the mosques he built was here. And the fact that he built this it's called the Kali Masjid, though its formal name was Kalan Masjid. And he built it here because there must have been a substantial population living in this area. And this was actually probably part of Firoz Shah's capital, which he had set up, which was called Firozabad. And today the only remnant is the citadel of that city, which is Firoz Shah Kotla. So that's all that's left, but it extended all the way to this. So that's another layer of the city's history. And then finally you come to the mid 17th century when Shah Jahan found Shahjahanabad, and all this is taken within the walls of Shahjahanabad. And in fact the closest city gate to this area, you know, where this road, which you have this old road exits the city, that is made into a gate, and that gate is named after Shah Turkman. It's called Turkman Darwaza, and of course today we call it Turkman Gate also. Shah Jahan decided to set up his capital first of all in Delhi, because it had this great aura of previous empires, the Sultanate period, and he was no doubt also looking at a more ancient past and the whole tradition that this had been the ancient capital of the Pandavas. The city of Indraprastha had been set up here. And I have a feeling that this was in his mind, because the site he chose was very close to Nigambodh. Nigambodh is literally the place which is believed that this is where Indra carried out, sort of various, sort of sacrifices, and, where, it's literally Indraprastha, the playground of Indra, where he did all this. And Shah Jahan decided that this is where he would build it, right next to the bank of the Yamuna. Shahjahanabad was in a line with various cities. Increasingly, they had been coming near the river. Of course, we started off in the southern ridge with Lal Kot, but soon enough, there's an old city which now has completely disappeared called Kilokri. So you had Kilokri on the river, then subsequent cities like Firozabad, like Deenpana, which was Humayun's city, and then Shahjahanabad, all beside the river. So it's like they are just moving north slowly. The Yamuna has been constantly changing its course eastwards, and in fact, the easiest way for somebody who does not understand satellite imaging and all those kind of things to actually follow the old course of the river is to look at the ancient settlements. Look at where Kilokri now is. There's a village called Kilokri, which is very close to Ashram Chowk, which is a major landmark of South Delhi. Look at where Firoz Shah Kotla is. Look at where Purana Killa is. And finally, look at where Shahjahanabad is, where the Red Fort is, where Daryaganj is. Daryaganj is literally the market beside the river. These are all sites which tell you where the river was, because the river flowed beside them. Shah Jahan is above all a great builder. that is his primary motivation for a lot of stuff that he does, including the establishment of a new capital at Shahjahanabad, because he wants to demonstrate that he can build a grand capital. And interestingly, the work begins with the Red Fort. It's called the Red Fort, it's called the Qila-e-Mualla, but it's not a Qila as in a defensive structure. It's a palace complex, it's a citadel of, as it's a place where the Mughal emperor lives and carries out the business of empire. That's the place he lives in. And all the energy was really concentrated on the Red Fort. They don't even think of the city walls before the Red Fort is complete. They don't even think of the Jama Masjid before the Red Fort is complete. All the energies for 9 years are concentrated from 1639 to 1648 when it's inaugurated. All the energies are concentrated on the Red Fort. It's only after that that the city walls come up. The only other imperial project really in Shahjahanabad is, or the emperor's own personal thing, is the Jama Masjid which he builds and puts the wall around, and two major streets, one north-south and one east-west. And that's it, because a lot of the other projects, mosques, there are some mosques which are built by his wives. One is the Fatehpuri Masjid, which is a beautiful mosque built by his wife Fatehpuri Begum, and so that is one. His daughter Jahanara plays an important role in Delhi. So she builds a sarai, a beautiful sarai, which is where today the town hall stands. It was demolished after the revolt of 1857, but that was a sarai where foreign traders used to come and stay there. She builds this beautiful chowk in front of it, with the original Chandni Chowk, because it was on this east-west road running from the Red Fort to the Fatehpuri Masjid, which had a channel of water running down in its middle. And when you came to this chowk, this square, the pool, it became a pool in the middle of the road. Chowk got its name from this pool as Chandni Chowk, because the moonlight reflected off the waters of the pool. So this these were the projects that were directly the Mughal emperor or his family members who built these things. But a large part of the development of the city was actually on a private initiative. The nobility acquired estates, built their havelis, their homes. Then specialist markets were built, some of them by entrepreneurs who sort of bought up land, built shops, let them out. The common people who were the craftsmen, the traders, they all established their homes. When we talk about it as a planned city, one mustn't imagine that every corner of it was planned by imperial diktat. It's a lot of individual initiative, community initiative that is going to the making of the city. When we go from the Red Fort westwards towards Fatehpuri Masjid, this long sort of large avenue is actually divided into 3 sections by 2 squares, and the first section goes from the Red Fort down to the first square, which is the Kotwali Chowk. Now on the left you see Dariba and the Jain Lal Mandir. Now this mandir, it's a Jain mandir. Dariba, which is again a locality dominated by Jains. This is in fact dates from the time of Shah Jahan, because Shah Jahan invited Jain merchants to come and set up their business in the new imperial capital. If you look at the older parts of the temple, you will see that there are these domes made out of red sandstone and white marble. Now this is very typical of Mughal architecture, and if you look today, it's almost impossible to see those domes because they are so overshadowed by the large red shikhars that you see on the temple. In fact, those shikhars are not that old, they date from the second half of the 20th century. And it's interesting that the shikhars were built at all But of course, there is the tendency to keep embellishing old temples by building new structures. But in this case, the fact that shikhars are built where earlier there were domes also tells us something, because at the time when this temple was originally built, those who built the temple did not think that domes were not somehow compatible with the temple. They didn't think that. For them, a dome was a dome and it was the thing to make. But by the time we come to the 20th century, it is probably a colonial influence, the influence of colonial scholarship, which has begun to tell Indians that domes are Muslim and temples must have shikhars, because that's temple architecture and that's Hindu architecture. In fact, there are many of the older temples, in fact all the older temples of Shahjahanabad, they all have domes. None of them have shikhars because that was not the architecture of the time in Delhi. Dariba was the lane, the actual street on which all the bankers had their shops and establishments. Nearby, they had their homes also, and one of them is a particularly nice one called the Khazanchi ki Haveli. Khazanchi literally means treasurer, and this was one of the important Jain merchants who was a big financier for not only the Mughal Empire, but later this was a family of Jain financiers, and they lent to the Mughal Empire as well as to the Marathas. And then when the East India Company came in the beginning of the 19th century, then to the East India Company as well. And the most well-known person in that family was Saligram, who lived in the first half of the 19th century. So that Haveli is of course still there, and it is a beautiful marble structure.
This is all that remains of a Mughal who could have been a great emperor. Dara Shikoh, the favourite son of Shah Jahan and the much loved prince of Shahjahanabad, built this library in 1637 near Kashmiri Gate. It is said that after the bloody war of succession, fought even as Shah Jahan was alive, the people of the capital rooted for Dara Shikoh and never forgave Aurangzeb for how he treated his father and brother. Author and historian Swapna Liddle, who has done extensive work on the history of Shahjahanabad, tells us what happened to the capital after Shah Jahan was sent on exile to Agra.
Aurangzeb succeeded Shah Jahan in Shahjahanabad under difficult circumstances. A war of succession had broken out while Shah Jahan was still alive, and we all know the story. Shah Jahan was exiled to Agra, and Aurangzeb soon overcame his brothers and made short work of them. Actually, Dara Shikoh, his older brother, who had also been had already been designated an heir by Shah Jahan, was very popular in Delhi, and as a result Aurangzeb was less than well liked, and he knew that. You can see how that pans out, because first of all, his first coronation does not take place within the walls of Shahjahanabad or even the Red Fort, but outside in Shalimar Bagh. That's where he's first crowned. Then a year later he does have a coronation ceremony in the fort itself. But he also decides to barricade himself in to an extent. So originally the tall gate of the fort, which used to face the main street, that is surrounded by a barbican which he puts up in front, which obscures that gate. And for us today, of course, it's an aesthetic problem, because we don't see the grand gate that Shah Jahan intended us to see. And Shah Jahan was aware of that, because when he heard in his exile in Agra that this had happened, he wrote to Aurangzeb and complained that he had treated his fort like a bride and put a veil in front of her face, and he didn't like that. Aurangzeb soon left for the Deccan, and he was to spend the rest of his life there, not really come back to Shahjahanabad much. So to that extent, Shahjahanabad ceased to be the center of power in terms of the residence of the emperor. However, there were important members of the royal family who continued to stay there. Jahanara, for instance, came back from, once Shah Jahan died, she had accompanied Shah Jahan into exile. But when he died, she came back to Delhi, and she, her sister Roshanara, these were ladies who played an important cultural role in the city also, because they were patrons of art, and they were rich women. So that cultural vibrancy continued, and Delhi, even before the setting up of Shahjahanabad, had been a trading center, an important trading center anyway, and that trading role still continued. So you still have your Jain merchants, you still have all the poetry and the talent that is there is still being patronized. And then we come, after the death of Aurangzeb, it becomes again a capital in a real sense, in which the Mughal emperor comes back to, there's Bahadur Shah and then Farrukh Siyar and so on. And Bahadur Shah, of course, did not spend very much time in Delhi as an emperor, but after that you have other rulers who are living in Delhi. But the empire is sort of, in some senses, being well on its way to decline, because there is civil war, there is all sorts of infighting among various factions and court, and weak rulers, inefficient rulers. So that decline is happening. Then that is compounded further by the invasions and attacks from outside. You have Nadir Shah's attack in 1739, and then Ahmad Shah Abdali later, and that kind of it takes its toll on the city. But it's remarkable that despite all that, you have a vibrant culture. In fact, Urdu poetry, for instance, really takes off in the 18th century. And some of the best poetry is written in this context of invasion. Some of the best poetry comes out of that. Many of the landmarks of Shahjahanabad are associated with these events that are taking place in the 17th century, 18th century and onwards. So you have the Kotwali Chowk. We were talking about the Kotwali Chowk. Kotwali Chowk gets its name from the Kotwali, the police headquarters, and that is the place where punishments are meted out also. So you have the execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur in 1675 under orders of Aurangzeb, which happens there. And incidentally, that's the reason why later a shrine was built to the Guru over there, and which is today the Gurudwara Seesganj. And we also have at a later date Banda Bahadur in the early 18th century. You have his followers being brought there and executed in large numbers. Then finally in 1857 you have the revolt which breaks out, and when that is suppressed and the British East India Company comes back in full force and takes a huge revenge on the people, there are these sort of stages that are put up where people are hanged. So these gallows are set up in front of the Kotwali, and you have another round of execution. So there is a lot of violence built in here. You must also remember that this is where the Kotwali Chowk, right next to the Kotwali Chowk is the Sunehri Masjid, and this is where in 1739 Nadir Shah sat on the steps and oversaw the massacre of citizens, and it said some 20,000 people were massacred. Nadir Shah invaded India. His invasion began from the Punjab, etc. in 1738. He made his leisurely way across, slowly conquering parts of Punjab and approaching Delhi, and it just says how poorly organized the Mughal Empire was at that time, that they did not adequately respond to it until March 39, when the imperial army meets Nadir Shah's army in Karnal, and the Mughals are defeated. So the fighting is not happening in Delhi, but later then Nadir Shah demands that he will come to Delhi and he will be formally crowned as the emperor, as having taken over the empire, and of course will be given a tribute and all that. That ritual of conquest has to take place, and they come to Delhi. the Mughal emperor comes first and he makes way for the conqueror to come, and everything is going, you know, he's not putting up any resistance, he's already been defeated. So he's welcoming him into the Red Fort, offering him his crown, and Nadir Shah very generously returns the crown and says, no, I'm going back as long as you give me your tribute. And all this is happening while outside, some of Nadir Shah's soldiers, they are off duty now. The battle has been won and they are off duty, and they are wandering around the streets of Delhi, and they must have been looking at this wonderful city that they've heard so much about, and they are shopping or whatever they're doing. And some people of Delhi who are wandering around, they start this rumor that actually Nadir Shah inside the Red Fort has been killed. And you must remember that this is March and Holi is just around the corner. So people say people are intoxicated as well. So the Delhi people were always very, there was this whole, certainly a crowd which was quite volatile and tending to these mob violence from time to time. And they go and they start to attack some of these soldiers who are casually wandering around, and some of those soldiers are killed. They are off duty, off guard. And when Nadir Shah hears of this, he decides, okay, now my army is stationed right outside, I'm going to call them in and I'm going to take account for all these killings. So he identifies very systematically the neighborhoods in which these killings had taken place, and he orders a massacre of the men. And that happens, and then the emperor at the time, Muhammad Shah, the Mughal emperor, he comes and sort of literally sends people to beg of this man to call it off, and they do. And then he extracts a further round of ransoms and tributes, and then he leaves. Once you have Muhammad Shah's reign with the attack of Nadir Shah, Ahmad Shah Abdali also attacked in the 50s and 60s. There are several attacks in this area. Then the Marathas actually gain control of large parts of North India, particularly Sindhia, and Delhi as well. So they become the actual de facto rulers of Delhi, and they prop up the Mughal emperor as a puppet. And that changes in 1803 because the Marathas themselves in North India are defeated by the East India Company, which has been slowly making its way up from Bengal and conquering large parts of the Doab, and they come to Delhi. And 1803 there is this battle which is known as the Battle of Patparganj, and they conquered Delhi. And over the next half a century, from 1803 to 1857, you have this uneasy situation where the East India Company is the actual ruler, but the Mughal emperor is still kind of a symbolic figurehead kind of person, puppet, and then becoming even less relevant than a puppet. Slowly his position is declining, and he's sitting in the Red Fort. And you have the last Mughal emperor who comes to the throne in 1837, really epitomizes that decline, because he is completely irrelevant politically, but as far as cultural influence goes, he is a huge cultural figure. And ironically, to quite an extent, that cultural ethos, the poetry, this is the era of some of the greatest poets, Ghalib and Momin, Bahadur Shah Zafar himself is a poet. So all that also continues, and whereas at the same time you have the British establishing their institutions, running the administration of the city.
The Kashmiri Gate area of Old Delhi is a far cry from what it was once. A breezy, green, affluent neighborhood where the nobles lived in their great estates during the Mughal era. This area also faced the brunt of the pitched battles during the revolt of 1857, when Indian soldiers marched to Delhi. The cannonball marks on Kashmiri Gate are a reminder of those bloody days. There was a reason for this. By the early 19th century, the British had moved in here and gradually taken charge. The St. James Church, built by the famous Colonel James Skinner, after whom the Skinner's Horse, a regiment in the Indian Army, is still named, was built in 1836.
Kashmiri Gate has always been a very exclusive and special area in the city of Shahjahanabad. Even today when we look at it, its character is quite different. It has these wide roads and a bit of open areas which you don't normally associate with old Delhi. And the reason for that is that this was prime real estate. It always has been. It was just north of the Red Fort. It was on one side just beside the Yamuna River. So this was where the richest and noblest people of the Mughal Empire built their homes. So you have Dara Shikoh, the heir of Shah Jahan, his favorite son, he builds a large mansion here. You have other Ali Mardan Khan, the minister, he builds his mansion here. So there are mansions being built, and that Mughal legacy is taken over by the East India Company as well, because when the East India Company comes here, they move into the same mansions which were once the biggest and best mansions of the Mughal nobility. So the Dara Shikoh's mansion is taken over by the resident. The resident is the highest British official in Delhi. So he takes it over as his residency, you know, where he works from, with his house also in the same complex. So that becomes the residency. The first resident who actually lived in this new Dara Shikoh's building and made a new residency there was David Ochterlony. He had bought this out of his own funds, which later the East India Company bought it and it became a permanent residency. And Ochterlony actually was an entrepreneur, and he bought a patch of land close to the residency and built a market there, a wholesale market which was named Nasirganj. And Nasirganj because after his own name, because he was given the title of Nasir-ud-Dawla by the Mughal emperor. So he had that title and he decided to build this market here, which soon after the company for a while bought it over. After he left, they bought it over and converted it into a cantonment and quartered some soldiers there for a while. But ultimately in the 20s, it was bought by James Skinner. Now James Skinner is associated in Indian history with Skinner's horse. Very interesting man, because he had a British father and an Indian mother. He had grown up in India in a very Indian ethos, and by the time late in life, he decided that he wanted to emphasize his British ancestry a little more, because this was a time when the East India Company was obviously on the ascendant and Indian powers were on the decline. So it helped to emphasize that part of your heritage, and he decided that the best place to live actually was in the Kashmiri Gate area. It's because that's the fashionable place, that's where all the British are living. So he bought a large estate here. He bought over this piece of land which was the erstwhile cantonment, and before that had been Nasirganj, and that's where he decides to build a church. And that again is his way of identifying with British society. And it works, because this becomes a church where the the highest of British officialdom and British society begin to worship. The bishop comes from Calcutta and consecrates it. In fact, James Skinner is himself confirmed in this church, and it does give him that prestige which he craved at that stage. As time passed, Dara Shikoh's mansion, which had been the residency, was to enter another phase in 1844, because that's when the Delhi College was moved here. The Delhi College was an interesting institution. It was the first Western style college in Delhi, established by the government, by the East India Company. It taught Urdu, Farsi, Arabic, but also English and Western sciences, etc. It was a very vibrant place. It had a beautiful library, it had laboratories, etc. Unfortunately, in 1857, this area was particularly badly hit. 1857 is of course when the revolt breaks out, and the revolt breaks out. There are soldiers who've mutinied in Meerut, and on the 10th of May and on the 11th of May they arrive in Delhi and slowly take over the city after having massacred sort of a lot of the European population of the city and those who are deemed to be their supporters. They also attacked what they saw as symbols of colonial rule, and in that they were rather indiscriminate because they targeted the church, St. James's Church, and also the Delhi College because it was a government college. So these two, they were badly looted, all their property was vandalized, the library was destroyed, the laboratory was destroyed. But that was not all. More destruction was to come after a while because the rule in Delhi, the independent rule of the rebel government in Delhi continued till September, and in mid-September the British broke through Kashmiri Gate to enter the city. Now the British had positioned themselves outside Kashmiri Gate and had been constantly shelling the place, and they broke through Kashmiri Gate, and even today you can see the marks of the cannonball and the blast that they must have used to break through. So that devastation you can still see. 1857 and particularly its suppression by the British really changed the face of Shahjahanabad, because first of all, a lot of the construction between the Red Fort and where you have your Jain temple, for instance, there and even beyond, there was a lot of construction which was completely razed. It was all the buildings were destroyed. In fact, just the temples were left standing by themselves. Jain temple, and there's a Hindu temple next to it. All the other buildings around had been completely destroyed. In the Red Fort, of course, there was destruction. Jahan Ara's Sarai was completely destroyed too. The hammam which had been in front of it, the chowk itself with its beautiful coffee shops and other shops were completely demolished, and the British built up their own buildings there. They built a town hall which still stands. They put a road through the other side, and it was named Edgerton Road after the commissioner, but people called it Nai Sadak, the new road, and it's still called the Nai Sadak. In the Red Fort, of course, there was destruction. The Red Fort was very different from what we see today, because to imagine it in the terms of what it would have been like when it was just built and how it evolved over time. First of all, the concept of courtyards. There were courtyards all over the Red Fort also. So each one of the buildings that we now see in isolation, the Diwan-e-Aam, the Diwan-e-Khas, the Rang Mahal, these were all set within or at one end of large courtyards. They were enclosed courtyards, and that was completely destroyed. But not only that, but in 1857, I would say about at least 95% of all the existing buildings in the fort were actually demolished. So you have only a few specimens of the most excellent of the architecture that has remained, but most importantly, you've lost the context. You don't understand these buildings as they would have functioned in Mughal times. So it's important to be able to understand that. Delhi as a whole, and Shahjahanabad certainly, has always been made up of a fairly diverse population. Capitals of empires, important trading centers tend to be like that. People come from all over to them, and Shahjahanabad was no exception. Khatri traders came and made it their home. There's a particular area, Sitaram Bazar, where you specifically have lanes which were dominated by the Kashmiri Pandits. So you have people coming from all over and settling down in Delhi. As far as the composition of the population went, the earliest figures that we have are from the early 19th century, where just under 50% were Muslim and just over 50% were either Hindu or Jain. So that was the kind of composition. But it has been changing, and the two major points of change have been firstly 1857 and then 1947. 1857, the Muslims were treated rather unfairly by the British, who decided that they would placed the onus of the revolt on the Muslims, though that had not been the case at all. Hindus and Jains had participated quite equally. But for various political reasons, this was decided, and the Muslims were kept out of the city much longer. So by that time because they had been evacuated, they just went and made homes elsewhere. So the composition, the balance between Hindus and Muslims changed a little bit further then. 1947 was another round when partition happened. Lot more Muslims left and lot more Hindus came in. So there again the composition is further, the balance continues to shift away from the Muslims of the city. It is interesting that when the East India Company is actually the real ruler of the city, it is bringing in new institutions like the Delhi College. At the same time, poetry and the traditional literature, which is based overwhelmingly on Farsi, which is Persian, and Urdu, it continues to flourish. And part of the reason definitely is the patronage of the Red Fort of the Mughal Emperor and the other members of the royal family. And that enables figures like Asadullah Khan Ghalib, the poet, to flourish at that time. And he's never able to make a very generous living, but he manages to survive, and he manages to compose, and he manages to find people who are willing to patronize him, and that makes all the difference, because we have some of the superlative, particularly in Urdu, some of the superlative examples of Urdu poetry coming out of that era in his life. And so his Haveli in Ballimara in Shahjahanabad actually marks for us a very important landmark in the intangible heritage of the city, because all those structures that we talk about, these are all in the context also of a cultural map of the city, and part of that cultural map is the poets of the city, and these landmarks therefore are very important. Shahjahanabad is definitely very closely connected with Mughal history and the association that it is a Mughal city. At the same time, the British also wanted to leave their mark on it, particularly right after the revolt. They put the railway line through, make the station inside Shahjahanabad. They put up landmarks like the town hall, like a clock tower which they built. They try to leave their mark on it. But I would say to some extent, the city, it's the people of Shahjahanabad who have made the city. And yes, the Mughals were an important cultural influence on that city, but at the same time, it has a continuity. People have continued, and it has changed, and it's continuously changing also. But that it's the people who actually make the culture. I think we need to first identify what makes Shahjahanabad special. You can have marketplaces anywhere. You can make malls, you can even recreate marketplaces. What is special about Shahjahanabad is its heritage spaces. The old Havelis, the old Katras, the old specialist lanes which have these markets like Dariba or Kharibauli, which is the spice market. It is these spaces themselves which make up what Shahjahanabad is. So we really need to conserve those spaces, and ideally you cannot make it into a museum. So it has to continue to function and have relevance in today. It needs a reinvention, and it needs for entrepreneurs to step in to make these places viable, to make them more relevant, have it's easy to think of boutique hotels, of course, but on a smaller scale, like even small cafes or even a sari shop, which if you can just imagine it actually functioning out of an old restored Haveli rather than a modern showroom, it would not lose anything by that. And I think there will be a demand, and there will be an interest in these spaces, and it will really lead to a rejuvenation. Shahjahanabad has a lot to offer. You can walk in the streets. I love to walk, so it's really, in fact in Shahjahanabad there is no choice, you have to walk. So you are forced to walk. At that pace you can really take in all the beautiful carving. I love to look at the Haveli doorways, just looking at the variety of carving, the architecture is beautiful. I love the street food because you get a wide variety of things to eat. You see people on the street. It's not an impersonal, sterile South Delhi colony. If you want to ask directions where to go, you don't know who to ask. Here it is, life is happening on the street. You have house painters who are sitting there, and you can go and engage a house painter there. Food is being sold, people are going about their daily business. The otla in front of Havelis, that little otla, symbolizes that kind of architecture. If you go in the mornings, you'll sometimes see somebody who's sitting there reading the morning newspaper with a glass of tea next to them. So there the streets are not conduits for traffic, they are public places. These are places where people meet.
These streets and gullies of Shahjahanabad are layered with tales. Tales of ambition, tales of wealth, tales of deceit, tales of loss. For over 350 years, life has been hectic here. Emperors have come and gone, kings have ruled, and the people have lived on. Today what is needed is a concerted effort to restore the historic lanes, palaces and markets and rejuvenate the spaces before we lose it all.